My name is Jaden, and maybe if you just looked from the outside, you'd think I was the kind of person who had always lived in luxury. The truth, though, was far more layered than that polished image ever suggested. I grew up in a sprawling house resting on a quiet hill in the suburbs of Seattle, a classically designed estate stretching over 18,000 square feet, complete with a hanging garden and a private pond, a property valued well beyond $60 million. Yet what made that place truly priceless had nothing to do with its market value. My father, Daniel Brooks, poured 15 years of his life into designing and building it himself. He was a renowned architect, the mind behind iconic corporate landmarks. But that house was his most personal creation. Every beam, every stone carried the weight of his patience and vision. None of us ever referred to it as a mansion. To him, it was simply a home, built on principles rather than profit. He used to say that a real home wasn't constructed with money, but with the character of the people who lived inside it. My mother, Helen, balanced that world perfectly. She taught finance at a community college, never dressed in labels, never impressed by status symbols. But sit through one of her lectures and you'd immediately understand why my father admired her so deeply. She had a rare talent for turning complex financial theories into meaningful life lessons, and she lived by them with quiet discipline. I remember being 8 years old and asking for a gaming console because all my classmates had one. She smiled calmly and asked if I wanted to learn how to earn it myself. From that day on, I folded laundry, mowed lawns, organized books in my parents' small library. It took almost 4 months to save enough. When I finally brought the console home, she told me I hadn't just bought a toy, I had learned what money actually meant. Despite the wealth surrounding us, my parents chose to send me to a public school. I rode the bus, carried homemade lunches, and never wore anything flashy. When I once visited a friend's house, my mother gently reminded me not to talk about our home unless someone asked. She told me that people should remember who I was, not where I lived. That lesson shaped me more than I realized at the time. I learned to move quietly through a world where assumptions were made without evidence, and I was taught that the most valuable things in life were integrity, resilience, and honesty. One afternoon, my father brought me to the highest floor of the house, a study wrapped in walnut panels with windows overlooking the entire city. He told me that one day the house would be mine, but that inheritance didn't define worth. Value, he said, must come from what I choose to build on my own. I carried those words with me as I grew older, believing them deeply, until the person I loved most tested everything I thought I understood. I once believed that humility protected you from judgment, but sometimes silence only invites speculation. That truth became painfully clear when I was 12. I attended Rockridge Middle School, a lively, modest place full of color and personality. I had a tight-knit group of friends, Chloe, Natalie, and Madison. Natalie was loud and curious, always asking questions she knew I wouldn't answer, teasing me about rumors of elevators and movie theaters. I brushed it off because I valued our friendship more than defending myself. Everything changed when Chloe's new gaming console broke. She had brought it to school proudly, and during recess she handed it to me to try. It slipped from my hands and shattered against the concrete. I apologized immediately and promised to fix it. That night, I told my mother what happened. She listened quietly and explained that while I could take responsibility, I couldn't rely on family wealth to erase mistakes. I worked for 2 weeks doing odd jobs and paid for the repair myself. But when I returned the console, Chloe didn't smile. Natalie mocked me, suggesting that someone rich like him wouldn't care about the cost. The rumors escalated quickly. By the next day, I was accused of deliberately breaking it or swapping it out. The situation reached the vice principal after a complaint was filed, something I later learned Natalie had orchestrated. My father took time off work to attend the meeting. He listened calmly, then presented the repair receipt, warranty details, and confirmation from the shop. He said only that truth didn't need to shout, it only needed to stand firm. I was cleared and the girls were reprimanded. But the real lesson came afterward. As we walked out, my father told me that some people would only ever see my wallet, not my heart, and that I should never let them decide my worth. After that, I became more guarded. I learned to set boundaries without apology. Years later, I still keep that old console, scratched and useless, as a reminder of how trust can fracture and how important it is to stand alone without losing yourself. When I was 35, I met Jack at a finance seminar in Denver where I was speaking on digital banking security. He was the only one who asked a thoughtful, challenging question. We talked afterwards, and I liked that he wasn't impressed by titles or curious about my background. He learned about me slowly, directly, without digging. After 2 years, we married in a quiet ceremony by Lake Tahoe. I believed my father would have approved. After the wedding, Jack moved into my downtown apartment. A month later, I took him to the house in the Western Hills, the one I hadn't shown anyone since my father passed. When the gates opened, I watched Jack fall silent. His curiosity changed that day reminded me of something I couldn't ignore. Questions followed, about ownership, inheritance, valuation. I grew cautious without fully understanding why. Then came the message from my mother. I rushed to the hospital and learned my father was dying, stage 4 pancreatic cancer. From that moment, everything else stopped. I spent my days at his bedside, reading to him, listening to his favorite music. Jack tried to be patient at first, but eventually his frustration surfaced. He asked how long I planned to stay away, questioned our priorities. Something inside me broke quietly. When my father passed, I felt hollow rather than loud with grief. The funeral reflects who he was: simple, dignified, honest. Afterward, my mother gave me his will. Inside it, he left me full ownership of the house he built with his own hands. The house was valued at nearly $5.5 million, but to me, it was priceless. Jack heard the news from a relative at the funeral, and his attitude shifted instantly. That night, over dinner, he suddenly asked, "So, what are you planning to do with that house?" I looked at him, a sense of caution rising in me. "I haven't thought about it yet. Everything's still too fresh." He nodded, then added, "I was just thinking if both of us were on the title, it might make things easier later. Legally, I mean." I didn't respond, but my heart tightened. For the first time, I felt Jack was looking at my father's legacy not as a family heirloom, but as a prize to be claimed. A few days later, I got a call from the family attorney, Mr. Peterson, my father's longtime friend. He confirmed that all the transfer documents were finalized and I was the sole legal owner of the house. I stood on the second-floor balcony of the mansion that windy afternoon, looking out at the garden my father once tended with his own hands, and I silently promised him I would protect this place no matter what. But I never imagined that the first person I'd have to protect it from would be the man sleeping next to me each night. 6 weeks after my father's passing, the atmosphere in our shared apartment had grown increasingly tense. Jack could no longer hide his restlessness. He started asking nonstop questions about the legalities of the house I had just inherited, and even though I gave clear answers repeatedly, he kept circling back to the same topic. One evening, as I was looking through my father's old keepsakes in the study, Jack showed up at the door with a more serious expression than usual. He handed me a stack of papers, placed them on the desk, and said casually, "I just met with a lawyer named Jerry Peterson. He knows a lot about inheritance laws in Washington. I think we should co-own the house to avoid future complications." I stared at him. "Jack, what are you saying? Why would the ownership need to be changed?" He shrugged, trying to seem harmless. "We're married, Jaden. What's yours is mine, right? It's just a formality." I sat up straight, my heartbeat quickening. "No, that house is a personal inheritance directly from my father, and you know that." He stayed quiet for a few seconds, then smiled, but the warmth was gone from his eyes. "Well, then I guess you won't be surprised to hear I already did it." I froze. "You did what?" Jack pulled out his phone, opened an email, and slid it toward me. It was a scanned copy of a property transfer form stamped "Pending Review." My name, Jaden Brooks, had been crossed out in red ink, replaced with Jack E. Nolan. I was stunned. "What the hell did you do?" Jerry said I could process the paperwork as a spouse if I could prove vested interest, and guess what? I already paid him $300,000 up front. I shot to my feet, my voice trembling. "You tried to transfer a property in my name without my consent? Are you insane?"
I did what had to be done. If you won't share, I have to protect myself. We can live like roommates if that's more comfortable for you. Otherwise, I think divorce is a reasonable option." Every word hit like a cold blade. The man I once thought would hold my hand through life now stood before me like a stranger, calculating and cold. I took a step back, struggling to stay calm. "Jack, what you've done isn't just illegal, it's betrayal. You took advantage of me and the trust I gave you." He crossed his arms, smirking. "Trust? What trust? You hid your family's entire wealth from me. I married someone who never shared anything truly important." I stood frozen, my heart pounding, but instead of arguing, I walked out of the room. I needed proof. I needed to know if what he said was just a bluff. And when I called my father's lawyer, the real Mr. Peterson, not this so-called Jerry, I learned things were worse than I thought. Mr. Peterson sighed after hearing my story. "Jaden, there's no licensed attorney named Jerry Peterson in this state. You've been scammed, and if Jack paid that person, he may have fallen victim to a legal fraud." It felt like the air was sucked out of my lungs. Jack hadn't just tried to steal my inheritance, he had also been gullible enough to lose a fortune in the process. But the deepest hurt didn't come from the financial loss. It came from realizing I had loved and trusted someone completely unworthy. That night, I came home to find Jack sitting at the dining table, his face pale. "Jerry's not answering his phone. I think I've been scammed." I didn't yell, I didn't curse. I simply placed the original property documents that Mr. Peterson had just sent on the table, along with a copy confirming I was the sole legal owner of the house. "You've crossed a line, Jack, and I have no reason to stay with you anymore." He opened his mouth to speak, but I raised my hand to stop him. "There's no explanation that can fix the trust you destroyed." I walked out of the room quietly, but inside a door had closed for good, and I knew from that moment on Jack was no longer part of my journey. 3 days after that final confrontation, I officially moved out of the apartment Jack and I had once shared. I took nothing but a suitcase of clothes and a wooden box holding the letters my father had written. Everything else, the memories, the dreams, and the promises, I left like someone letting go of a stone sinking to the bottom of a lake. I moved back to the hillside mansion, once the home of my childhood, now the only peaceful place I had left. I thought that after I exposed the truth and cut ties, Jack would quietly disappear from my life, but I had underestimated the greed and delusion still lingering inside him. That morning, while I was walking with my mother in the backyard garden, the gate buzzer rang non-stop. On the security screen, I saw Jack standing outside, hands on his hips, his face flushed. Either from anger or embarrassment, I couldn't tell. I picked up my phone and connected to the intercom system. "Jack, what are you doing here?" He looked straight into the camera, his voice loud and firm. "Jaden, I have a right to enter this house. You're holding it unlawfully. We need to talk." I responded calmly. "I'm the legal owner. If you don't leave, I'll call the police." As if he had anticipated my reaction, Jack pulled a stack of papers from his coat pocket. "I had a new lawyer go over everything. You think you're smart, but I'm not naive anymore." I didn't say another word. I immediately called the security team. Less than 5 minutes later, 2 security officers arrived and asked Jack to leave the premises. He resisted, yelling that he was the victim, that he had been tricked, that I had no heart. But I didn't go outside. I just stood behind the glass door, watching him scream at the sky, while the men who once worked for my father stayed silent and did their jobs. That afternoon, I met with my lawyer at the office to finalize something important, a restraining order. I no longer wanted to live with the fear that Jack might show up at my door, switching between begging and threatening. Just as we were about to finish, my phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number appeared. Jerry was scammed out of $360,000. Jerry is a fake name, not licensed in any state. The message came from an old acquaintance in the legal field who had once worked with Jack on a marketing project. He knew Jack was spiraling, having lost his money, his reputation, and his marriage. It turned out that the lawyer Jerry Jack had blindly trusted was actually a professional con artist. He had been investigated multiple times for impersonating legal professionals and scamming the gullible.
Jack had wired him a massive amount, $360,000, to speed up the transfer of ownership, only to receive a series of forged documents so well crafted they nearly fooled me too. I should have felt vindicated, but in truth, I just felt empty. Jack had thrown himself into the abyss, and no one could pull him out but himself. That evening, I sat alone in my father's old library, the soft light glowing across the polished wooden desk. I opened a drawer and took out the letter my father had written to me before he passed, a familiar, steady handwriting that calmed me just by looking at it. My dear Jaden, if one day you find your trust betrayed, remember trust is the most precious thing we build. It takes time to create, but can vanish with a single lie. Don't mourn what was lost, because losing what's unworthy is sometimes the only way to keep yourself. I folded the letter and took a deep breath. I knew I had crossed into a new chapter of life without Jack, without the dreams others once tried to exploit. And if my father had left me anything more valuable than the hilltop estate, it was the strength I held in that moment. Outside, the breeze whispered through the maple trees. I could hear my mother laughing with the gardener. Life was moving on, and for the first time in years, I felt like I was truly in control, not just of the house, but of my heart. The divorce proceedings moved faster than I expected, perhaps because Jack no longer had the strength to fight. He had no lawyer, no money, and most importantly, no trust left from me. We signed the papers at a small office in downtown Seattle, a place where no one knew my name or my past, so different from the sunny, laughter-filled wedding by Lake Tahoe just 2 years before. Jack didn't say much during the signing. He just kept his head down, dark circles under his eyes, his hands trembling slightly. When the final stamp hit the paperwork, I stood up first. I hope you find your way back to yourself. That was all I could say without letting my heart lose direction again. I returned to the estate and extended its familiar calm by transforming my father's old room into a space for meditation and reading. My mother, after staying with me for some time, began focusing on herself, taking art classes, gardening, walking every morning. The house, once wrapped in grief, was slowly breathing again. Then came the day of my father's first memorial. We kept it simple, just a few close friends, some longtime colleagues and neighbors who had known our family since I was a child. Everything was thoughtfully prepared, from the small altar in the library to the white flowers lining the walkway. The setting was solemn, but still warm. As the ceremony began, I noticed a familiar figure outside the iron gate. His eyes met mine through the security camera. I froze for a few seconds. Jack. He looked thinner than the last time I saw him. His shirt was wrinkled, his hair slightly messy, and his eyes sunken. He placed a hand on his chest when he saw me watching, as if silently pleading. I stepped onto the porch, but kept my distance. "Why are you here, Jack?" He swallowed hard. "I just wanted to say I'm sorry, to you and to him. I know I don't deserve to be here, but I need you to know I've lost everything." I looked at him, trying to keep my voice steady. "You had the chance to hold on to at least one thing, but you chose to give it all up for greed. I was duped. I was stupid. I get that now." The sound of chanting began inside. The guests had all gathered. I took a deep breath, then spoke firmly. "Today is for my father. This isn't your stage for redemption. If you still have any respect for me or for him, please leave." Jack nodded, but didn't move. He took a few steps back, eyes full of one last silent plea. "I'm not asking for forgiveness, just don't hate me." I stayed silent, not because I hated him, but because I had nothing left in me to feel. I signaled to the security guards. They understood, stepped out quietly without making a scene. One of them spoke softly to Jack and escorted him away from the gate area. I didn't look back. I returned inside where everyone was waiting, where my father's photo sat on the table, surrounded by white flowers and glowing candles. The ceremony went on. No one mentioned Jack's appearance, as if he'd never crossed that gate, but inside me, something closed for good. Not the relationship, just the last fragments of regret. That night, I sat alone in the tea room my father had designed just for my mother. Outside, a gentle rain had begun to fall. I poured myself a cup of hot Earl Grey and watched the raindrops trail down the window. I thought about Jack, how he entered, stayed, and then exited my life like a storm, loud, chaotic, shaking everything I thought was solid. But after all, the rain always stops, and the trees bloom again. The house lights up, my mother smiles every morning, and I can finally sleep in peace. When spring returned and the maple trees around the estate began to bud, I knew it was time to write a new chapter in my life. The sorrow over my father had settled into memory, and the scars from Jack were beginning to heal. One early morning, as my mother and I sat at the wooden table under the great arbor, sipping coffee and looking out at the backyard, my mother suddenly said, "Jaden, do you think we could turn this place into something special for others?" I looked at her, a bit surprised, then realized what she meant. She wasn't talking about selling or sharing the house, she meant giving it a new purpose. I once heard my father say, "A beautiful house isn't just for admiring, it's for living, breathing with people." And now, as my life took a new turn, perhaps the estate needed a new purpose too, something beyond its material value or legacy. We started by clearing out the basement, which had previously just been storage. I turned it into a small event hall with classic stone walls, polished hardwood floors, and warm ambient lighting. The backyard was expanded into an outdoor wedding space with a white wooden arch draped in vines and rows of lavender lining the path. My mother, who loved flower arranging, took on the role of event space designer. She named the project the Brooks Estate to honor my father. We hired a team of young engineers to assess the home's structure, making sure everything met safety standards for hosting guests. A quiet reading room became a tea party area. The vintage ballroom on the second floor got a sound system upgrade for small piano performances. Word spread quickly through word of mouth. The first neighbor held their 30th wedding anniversary celebration there. Then, a young couple from Oregon booked the Brooks Estate for an intimate wedding with just 40 guests. The awe in their eyes as they stepped through the gate, the applause beneath the wooden beams, the laughter echoing through the garden, it all made me feel I had done the right thing. And for the first time in years, I felt like I was truly free.
No more dry financial reports, no more endless Zoom calls, just bright, grateful faces and the simple joy of a perfect celebration. I also began writing again, old journal entries, memories of my father, reflections from my failed marriage, not for publishing, but for healing. Strangely, the mansion, once filled with sorrow, was now a place of restoration. Each morning, my mother and I walked the vast grounds, baskets of fresh flowers in hand. We discussed decor ideas for the coming week, chose background music for upcoming weddings, or sometimes just sat by the koi pond, watching the fish glide beneath the clear water. Our mother-daughter relationship deepened more than ever. We were no longer just family under one roof. We were true partners, companions. One day, while reviewing the event booking log, my mother gently asked, "What do you think your father would say if he saw what we're doing now?" I smiled, my eyes turning toward the sunlight streaming through the window. I believe he'd be proud, because we kept our promise to keep this house alive in spirit. We didn't expand too quickly. We accepted no more than 3 events a month to ensure quality and attention to detail. Every staff member was someone we knew and trusted, carefully chosen not just for their skills, but for their heart. The estate was no longer a relic of a former life, but a launch pad for a new journey. I used to think loss was an ending, but it turned out to be a transition, one that helped me find a stronger, clearer version of myself. The Brooks Estate continued to host weddings, reunions, and even quiet celebrations for those on their own path to healing. And me? I remained behind the scenes, growing steadier and happier with each passing day. At the end of that summer, as the last lavender blooms in the garden began to fade, I received an unexpected email. The sender, Jack. The subject line read simply, "Thank you." It took me almost 10 minutes to open it, not because I was still angry or hurt, but because I wasn't sure I wanted to know anything more about him. But curiosity won, and I read, "Jaden, I know you probably don't want to hear from me, but I just need to say one thing. Thank you. Thank you for ending everything when you did. It forced me to look at myself and face things I never had the courage to admit. I got a job at a small career counseling center in Spokane. It's not flashy, but it's real. I help people who've been incarcerated or bankrupt find direction again. Maybe because I hit rock bottom too, I have the patience to really listen. I'm not asking for forgiveness, but I hope you know the things you once believed in me weren't entirely wrong. I just wasn't mature enough to hold on to them. Wishing you all the strength you've always had. Jack." I closed the laptop and sat quietly by the second-floor window, where I could see the entire garden turning to autumn. The maple trees were starting to burn a brilliant red, the sunlight dancing gently across the rippling pond, and the breeze carried a soft scent of herbs through the air. I didn't cry, I didn't smile, I just felt a lightness inside me, as if the last stone had finally been lifted after a long uphill climb. Knowing Jack was living a more honest life didn't make me want to return to the past, but it helped me believe that sometimes fractures can be the beginning of rebirth, not just for me, but for him too. The last months of the year passed in joyful busyness at the Brooks estate. We hosted our first autumn wedding with a rustic theme: oak wood, golden candles, and hand-tied wildflower bouquets. The bride, a literature teacher from Portland, whispered to me as she was leaving, "You didn't just give us a venue, you gave us a real beginning." I only smiled, but that sentence touched something deep within me. In the evenings, I often sat with my mother on the back porch, holding a warm cup of tea, watching the twinkling garden lights my father had once installed by hand. He had designed the lighting to highlight every plant, every path. He didn't need to say anything. I could still feel him there, in the wind rustling the maples, in the soft glow over the pond, and in every decision I made with a sincere heart. The estate, my father's life's work, was no longer just a piece of property. It was proof of the power of family love, of resilience in the face of hardship, and of the belief that every crack can be where the light gets in. I once lost everything in the blink of an eye: love, trust, even the image of myself in the mirror. But I found it all again in a different way, not through someone else's promises, but through my own actions, choosing what was worth keeping and letting go of what wasn't. One early winter morning, I stood on the second-floor balcony, the cold air brushing my face, looking down at the lawn where a couple was taking wedding photos. The bride in her white dress was laughing brightly, while the groom held her hand tightly, as if afraid the wind would carry her away. I rested my hand on the wooden railing, the fresh paint still faintly fragrant, and I understood. This was the end of an old journey, but also the beginning of hundreds of new ones, all starting from this place. The Brooks estate wasn't just a home preserving my father's legacy, it was a symbol of a woman's choice, a woman who once lost her way but found herself again, strong, independent, and no longer needing anyone else to define her worth. And I knew, no matter what turns the future might hold, I would always remember one thing: no one can take anything from you unless you hand over your trust blindly. And sometimes the only way to protect your most precious inheritance is to learn how to let go at the right time. From my own story, I've realized that loss isn't always the end. It can be the beginning of growth. I once loved, trusted the wrong person, and fell because of things I couldn't control. But it was those very fractures that taught me how to rise and rebuild a life with resilience and intentional choices. Happiness doesn't come from having someone by your side, it comes from knowing your own worth and never letting anyone else define it for you. What do you think about Jaden's journey and the choices she made? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to follow the channel so you won't miss the next meaningful and heartfelt stories about life.